Before the world learned to fear breathing beside strangers, a quiet ritual had already taken shape. Long before emergency announcements and global anxiety, a simple mask carried meanings deeper than protection alone. This story is not about pandemics, mandates, or statistics, but about how culture slowly shapes ordinary behavior. It speaks of courtesy practiced silently, responsibility expressed without confrontation, and awareness woven patiently into routine public life. Across decades of shared space, masks became symbols of thoughtfulness rather than signs of danger. To understand this practice is to glimpse a society where consideration precedes instruction and harmony quietly governs choice. Long before global health emergencies shaped headlines, mask wearing quietly entered everyday life through early 20th century modernization and urban growth. During the 1918 influenza pandemic and recurring tuberculosis outbreaks across the 1920s, crowded trains, factories, and schools encouraged practical face coverings. Newspapers and public notices from the Taisho era discussed hygiene and mutual responsibility, framing masks as common-sense tools rather than extraordinary defenses. Adoption spread without dramatic resistance because social behavior already valued order, cleanliness, and awareness within shared public spaces. By the early Showa period, masks were visible during illness seasons, establishing familiarity that survived long after threats faded. This early normalization laid foundations for habits that required no coercion, only shared understanding later. Laws were never the engine sustaining this behavior, because unwritten expectations carried greater weight within community life. Schools emphasized consideration for classmates, workplaces modeled restraint during sickness, and families reinforced habits through example rather than punishment. Sociologists later described this pattern as self-regulation, where individuals adjust conduct to preserve social harmony. During the 1950s and 1960s economic recovery, dense commuting intensified sensitivity toward others sharing limited space. Mask wearing functioned as a quiet apology, signaling awareness without demanding acknowledgement or enforcement mechanisms. Such practices survived because belonging mattered more than personal convenience in everyday public encounters across generations nationwide. Compliance emerged from expectation and mutual observation, not fear of penalties, inspections, or written directives imposed externally. This social training explains why masks endured without formal mandates even when risks appeared distant. Behavior learned early becomes instinctive, especially within cultures emphasizing awareness over assertion in public life. By the late 20th century, seasonal influenza and pollen allergies reinforced usage through repetition rather than alarm. The Heisei era normalized personal choice guided by collective consideration, maintaining continuity without public debate. Masks existed because society had long practiced thinking beyond the self, preparing citizens to act responsibly before questions were asked. Such readiness would later appear effortless to outsiders, though it grew slowly from decades of shared expectation. What looked automatic was carefully cultivated, shaped by history, environment, and deeply rooted social awareness over time. The real beginning of mask wearing emerged during rapid urban expansion between 1900 and the early 1920s. Industrialization concentrated workers into factories, trams, boarding houses, and schools where shared air became unavoidable. Cities such as Tokyo and Osaka grew denser each year, intensifying everyday exposure to seasonal respiratory illness. After the 1918 influenza pandemic reached the archipelago, awareness of airborne sickness settled deeply into public consciousness. Tuberculosis followed through the 1920s and 1930s, shaping caution within crowded homes and workplaces nationwide. Masks appeared as simple cloth barriers, adopted by people already accustomed to adjusting personal behavior for collective well-being and stability. These early masks carried no symbolic meaning and triggered no ideological response or public dispute. Health officials described them as practical hygiene tools, similar to washing hands or improving ventilation in confined spaces. Factory supervisors encouraged usage during illness, while families used them during winter outbreaks without social pressure. There was no sense of emergency, no televised fear, and no moral panic surrounding personal compliance. Newspapers of the Taisho and early Showa periods mentioned masks casually, framing them as sensible responses to everyday urban life. Adoption spread gradually through observation, repetition, and quiet agreement rather than public instruction or enforcement. What mattered most was how seamlessly the habit blended into routine living without disrupting social harmony. Practices that solve visible problems tend to remain when they demand little explanation or resistance. By the mid-20th century, masks no longer appeared foreign or temporary within daily life. They existed in the background of commuting crowds, factory floors, and neighborhood clinics. This quiet permanence reflected a broader pattern where useful behaviors are absorbed slowly and retained instinctively. Mask wearing entered society the same way many habits do, through silent usefulness, shared necessity, and gradual acceptance that never demanded attention. The years following 1945 were defined by physical devastation, emotional exhaustion, and the urgent need to rebuild everyday life. Cities lay damaged after air raids, while millions lived in cramped temporary housing, dormitories, and shared family spaces. These crowded conditions increased vulnerability to tuberculosis, influenza, and chronic respiratory illnesses during the late 1940s. Hospitals struggled with shortages, and medical infrastructure remained fragile throughout the early occupation years. Public health campaigns during 1946 and 1947 emphasized prevention, restraint, and mutual awareness rather than punishment or legal enforcement. Masks appeared naturally within this environment, serving as simple barriers when illness spread easily through proximity. Responsibility became a guiding message during national recovery, shaping how behavior was discussed and encouraged publicly. Posters, school guidance, and workplace notices framed health practices as duties owed to neighbors and coworkers. Mask wearing aligned with these messages, reinforcing the idea that personal discomfort was acceptable when others benefited. There were no fines for noncompliance, and no police enforcement surrounding health behavior. Instead, social expectation operated quietly, reinforced through shared hardship and observation. During the early 1950s economic recovery period, commuting increased again, strengthening habits formed during scarcity. Wearing a mask signaled discipline, awareness, and participation in rebuilding collective stability. This period cemented mask wearing as part of a broader survival mindset, shaped by cooperation and endurance. Actions that reduced strain on fragile systems were valued as contributions to national recovery. Protecting others from illness symbolized responsibility toward families, workplaces, and the future. By the mid-1950s, these behaviors no longer felt temporary or exceptional. They blended into daily routines, shaped by memory of vulnerability and shared recovery. Mask wearing aligned with rebuilding mentality, reinforcing social cohesion without verbal instruction or force. In post-war Japan, protecting others became part of rebuilding the nation, expressed quietly through everyday conduct. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, mask wearing gradually detached from illness alone and entered social etiquette. Economic growth increased commuting density, placing strangers closer together inside trains, offices, and classrooms daily. During this period, wearing a mask, while ill, became an unspoken courtesy rather than a medical announcement. It communicated awareness of shared space without requiring explanation or apology. Health education during the Showa era reinforced the idea that small personal actions could reduce inconvenience to others. Masks quietly fit this philosophy, offering protection while expressing restraint and consideration. Over time, repeated use during ordinary sickness normalized their presence beyond moments of visible crisis. A major shift occurred during the 1980s with the widespread recognition of cedar pollen allergies, known as Kafunsho. Large-scale post-war reforestation caused pollen levels to surge, affecting millions each spring. Masks became everyday companions during allergy season, worn by healthy individuals managing symptoms rather than preventing contagion. This changed public perception significantly, as masks no longer signaled weakness or sickness. Instead, they reflected self-management and sensitivity toward people sharing enclosed spaces. Pharmacies began selling specialized masks, and advertisements framed them as lifestyle tools. Daily usage during pollen season made masks familiar, neutral, and socially accepted across age groups and professions nationwide. As meanings shifted, masks evolved into a subtle form of communication embedded within social behavior. Wearing one conveyed awareness, restraint, and acknowledgement of others without verbal interaction. It functioned as a quiet signal saying, "I am aware of you," within crowded environments. This unspoken message aligned with broader cultural patterns valuing harmony and non-intrusion. By the 1990s, mask wearing had fully detached from fear or emergency contexts. It became situational, flexible, and respectful, guided by personal judgment shaped through shared norms. In Japan, masks evolved from protection into manners, sustained by empathy rather than obligation or enforcement. By the mid-20th century, social behavior was deeply shaped by the idea of avoiding maiwaku, meaning causing trouble or inconvenience to others. This concept had existed for centuries, but post-war urban density between the 1950s and 1970s intensified its everyday importance. Living closely required heightened sensitivity toward noise, space, timing, and even breathing within shared environments. Rather than relying on spoken reminders, society leaned on silent adjustment and mutual observation. High-context communication meant meaning was often implied instead of explained directly. Mask wearing fit naturally into this framework because it allowed awareness to be shown without verbal acknowledgement or confrontation. High-context communication encourages people to read atmosphere, behavior, and subtle signals rather than explicit instruction. From schools to workplaces, individuals learn early to anticipate expectations through observation rather than written rules. During the rapid economic growth of the 1960s, crowded trains and offices demanded this silent coordination daily. Wearing a mask during illness required no announcement and avoided drawing attention to personal conditions. Others understood the gesture immediately, preserving harmony within limited shared space. This system reduced friction because behavior aligned automatically with collective comfort. Masks therefore operated as social cues within a culture already trained to interpret unspoken meaning effectively. Following norms without being told does not stem from blind obedience, but from internalized awareness developed over time. Sociological studies from the 1970s describe this behavior as self-regulation guided by social sensitivity. Actions that minimized disruption were praised implicitly, while disruptive behavior invited quiet disapproval rather than punishment. Mask wearing fit perfectly because it reduced potential inconvenience without demanding recognition. It required no authority, no enforcement, and no explanation. The act communicated responsibility while preserving personal privacy. Masks are not about obedience. They are about awareness, functioning smoothly within a system built on mutual consideration and silent understanding. When COVID-19 emerged globally in early 2020, existing habits were suddenly placed under intense public attention. Daily life changed, yet mask wearing did not feel unfamiliar or disruptive to social rhythm. Government guidance emphasized cooperation, caution, and timing rather than punishment or strict individual mandates. There were no nationwide fines for individuals, and enforcement relied largely on public messaging. People adjusted behavior through shared expectation shaped long before emergency announcements appeared. The situation tested whether long-standing habits would endure pressure, uncertainty, and prolonged disruption. Compliance appeared high not because of fear, but because behavior already matched cultural expectations. Wearing a mask felt like a continuation of courtesy rather than a sudden obligation imposed externally. During the same period, other Asian societies followed different paths shaped by earlier epidemic memory or stronger regulatory systems. Some relied on formal mandates influenced by experiences such as SARS in 2003. Others emphasized enforcement mechanisms to achieve public compliance quickly. These varied approaches highlighted how responses were shaped by history rather than identical regional thinking. What stood out most was how little explanation was required for widespread participation. Mask wearing aligned with existing social instincts developed through decades of shared space awareness. The behavior was already embedded within routines involving commuting, illness seasons, and allergy periods. When guidance later relaxed after 2022, continued usage revealed habit rather than obedience. People adjusted individually, choosing situations where masks felt appropriate rather than mandatory. COVID revealed cultural differences. It did not create them, exposing foundations built quietly across generations rather than constructed during crisis. By 2022 and into 2023, government guidance surrounding mask usage was gradually relaxed across public spaces. Announcements emphasized personal judgment rather than collective obligation, signaling a shift from coordinated response to individual choice. Trains, schools, and workplaces adjusted signage, allowing people to decide based on comfort and situation. This transition occurred without major disruption, protest, or confusion within everyday routines. Many people removed masks immediately, while others continued wearing them in specific settings. The absence of strict direction revealed how deeply habits had already settled within daily life through long practice. A significant number of people continued wearing masks for reasons unrelated to regulation or fear. Seasonal illness, allergies, crowded commuting hours, and personal comfort remained strong influences. Social awareness also played a role, especially during flu season or when feeling unwell. Wearing a mask still communicated consideration rather than anxiety, maintaining its familiar social meaning. Some felt subtle social pressure, while others experienced relief in having a choice. This balance created a flexible environment where different behaviors coexisted without visible tension or judgment. Masks gradually became optional but never strange, retaining legitimacy within shared spaces. Seeing both masked and unmasked faces became normal, reflecting diversity of comfort rather than social division. Younger generations experimented more freely, while older individuals often maintained established habits. The key difference was absence of stigma on either side of the decision. Choice replaced instruction, yet patterns shaped by respect remained visible. Freedom did not erase routines built over decades of mutual awareness. In Japan, freedom doesn't erase habits shaped by respect, allowing tradition and individuality to exist together calmly. Older generations carry memories shaped by post-war recovery, public health vulnerability, and decades of seasonal illness awareness. For many elders, mask wearing remains ordinary health etiquette learned during the 1950s and 1960s. It represents discipline, responsibility, and respect for shared space rather than reaction to specific threats. Wearing a mask when unwell feels automatic, similar to staying home or lowering one's voice. These habits were reinforced through lived experience with fragile healthcare systems and crowded living conditions. As a result, elders often maintain mask use calmly, without anxiety or social display, treating it as routine courtesy within everyday life. Working-age adults occupy a space shaped by obligation, mobility, and constant interaction with strangers. Daily commuting, professional environments, and family responsibilities reinforce sensitivity toward public behavior. Many adults view mask wearing as situational responsibility rather than fixed identity. During illness, crowded travel hours, or seasonal outbreaks, masks remain practical and socially reassuring. At the same time, adults are comfortable removing masks when contexts feel relaxed or safe. This flexibility reflects maturity rather than uncertainty. Decisions are guided by awareness of surroundings and others rather than adherence to rules. Responsibility, not compulsion, defines adult behavior within public spaces. Younger generations express greater individuality, yet awareness remains present beneath changing style and attitude. Teenagers and young adults are more selective, often influenced by fashion, comfort, and peer expression. Masks may appear less consistently, yet they return during exams, crowded trains, or illness periods. Children learn mask use through guidance rather than command, especially within schools and families. Teachers explain situations where masks are appropriate, encouraging understanding rather than fear. This approach frames masks as tools, not obligations. Across generations, habits evolve without disappearing. Mask culture is adapting, not disappearing, shaped continuously by context, education, and shared understanding across age groups. Urban life has always intensified awareness of shared space through density, rhythm, and constant proximity. Metropolitan areas such as Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama concentrate millions into trains, sidewalks, offices, and apartment buildings daily. Since the post-war commuter boom of the 1950s and 1960s, crowded movement required silent coordination and behavioral adjustment. Mask wearing naturally persisted within these environments because it reduced friction without explanation. During rush hours, enclosed platforms, and peak flu seasons, masks remain practical signals of awareness. The city reinforces habits through repetition, making mask use feel intuitive rather than deliberate. Urban routines reward behaviors that soften crowd pressure and preserve collective comfort. Rural communities follow a different pattern shaped by space, familiarity, and slower daily rhythm. Smaller populations and closer social ties reduce constant exposure to strangers, making mask use more situational. People often know one another personally, lowering perceived need for continuous precaution. Masks appear during illness, hospital visits, or seasonal outbreaks, but rarely dominate daily interaction. This selective usage reflects practicality rather than resistance. Rural habits prioritize relevance over visibility, adopting masks when conditions require them. The absence of density allows flexibility, yet shared values remain consistent. Courtesy is expressed through timing and context rather than constant display. A brief regional mirror reveals how other Asian societies followed separate paths shaped by environment and history. In several neighboring countries, masks became strongly associated with air pollution, industrial smog, or sudden public health emergencies. Usage often rises sharply during crises, then recedes when conditions normalize. This pattern highlights a clear difference in meaning rather than behavior. Mask wearing there frequently signals protection from external threat. The Japanese approach associates masks with internal awareness of others sharing space. Urban and rural expressions may differ, but underlying intent remains consistent. Masks function less as shields against danger and more as gestures of social consideration embedded within daily life. This story has traced how a simple object became a quiet language shaped by history, environment, and shared responsibility rather than fear or enforcement. From early urban crowding to post-war recovery, mask wearing settled into daily life because it matched long-standing values of awareness, restraint, and care for others. Over decades, habits formed through repetition, observation, and lived experience, creating behavior that required little explanation. What appears automatic today was patiently cultivated through social expectation, memory, and mutual adjustment within shared spaces. Across generations and regions, differences in expression never erased the underlying meaning behind the practice. Elders carried etiquette learned during vulnerability, adults balanced responsibility with choice, youth adapted habits to comfort and expression, and children learned situational understanding rather than obligation. Urban density reinforced constant awareness, while rural life allowed flexibility without abandoning respect. Even during global disruption, existing patterns guided behavior calmly, revealing foundations built long before modern crises entered public conversation or media narratives. This perspective reminds us that culture often shapes conduct more deeply than rules ever could. Quiet habits speak through consistency, not command, revealing how societies teach care without instruction. If this exploration helped you see everyday behavior through a deeper cultural lens, support Asia Within by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others. Your engagement helps thoughtful stories continue reaching curious minds across cultures, histories, and human experiences worldwide.